So the one that follows right now is a fireside chat. It involves Vin Sharma, who is the product strategy and marketing manager at Intel, and Rayid Ghani. He is the chief scientist for the Obama for America campaign.
Oh, sorry.
All right. Right, it's great to be here with you.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's a much anticipated session, and I think everybody wants to know your secrets, because the next election will eventually be upon us, and perhaps the same methods will apply.
Hopefully not soon.
So tell us, when organizations turn to data analytics, they're typically looking at a massive amount of data, and they're looking for what they think of as insight. Now, insight could have only gotten you this far with an election. Your end state was not insight, it was something else. Can you tell us more about how you used insight?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's sort of this perception from non-data users that, people like me sit around looking at lots of data and trying to figure out, find these little insights and these nuggets, people used to call them, and these aha moments where big discoveries happen and then everything is about that. It turns out practical, data, anything, analytics, science, anything you want to call it, is about operationalizing the use of these little things. And that's basically what our biggest challenge and biggest achievement was, that we were able to take data, do something with it, but then put it into production in a way that millions of volunteers were able to take action, making phone calls and going door to door. Billions of emails were able to send using the same data behind it. Lots of things around social media, on TV ads. Everything that we did was making predictions at an individual level about who's supporting Obama, who's persuadable, who's going to go and vote. Use that to then design an intervention and then basically our deployment was have people or machines take action by contacting people and talking to them.
Now, you said persuadable and not undecided. Is there a difference between those two?
Yeah, there's a huge difference because again, the urban myth sort of is that there's these undecided people, and only if you could help them decide, you can win the election. And it turns out there is no undecided really. If you're undecided, you're mostly apathetic. You're not going to vote because you guys, most of you probably live around here, so. You haven't really, you're not flooded by the TV ads and the emails that a person in a swing state is exposed to. And a typical person in a swing state has enough information to make a decision. They just choose not to do, which means they're not undecided. Persuadable is something that's a more direct goal for us, right? So what we decided this time around was really focus. We had a couple of teams, one focused on doing experiments and one focused on building these models. And what they did was they really built, they did experiments to figure out who's persuadable, which means if I have a particular conversation with them, their likelihood of supporting Obama will increase. Based on those experiments, we built these predictive models that then allowed us to score every person in the country between 0 and 100. That says 100 is the most persuadable and 0 is the least persuadable. So when our volunteers made phone calls to persuade people, they would go down from the top and start going down. Call this guy, this guy, this guy, because these are the most persuadable. And don't waste your effort on the least persuadable, because you'll be wasting time and money.
Now, how complex were these models? Because when Nate Silver talks about the methods he used, he essentially says there were relatively simple statistical means and averages and so on and so forth. I would imagine for you the predictive models were a lot more complex. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I mean, they're different. So one thing that important to realize is Nate Silver is not doing what we're doing. His goal is very different. He's taking 15 poll numbers and predicting the current state. We are running a large billion-dollar organization. We are allocating resources. Where do these millions? We made about 120 phone calls and door knocks, contacts. Right? We've sent 5 billion emails. We spent a few million dollars running TV ads. So our goal was resource allocation and targeting, and not prediction only. So our models are different, whether they're complicated or more or less complicated, I don't know because we don't know what he did. But our models were basically, we didn't have that much data. So one thing to kind of, we're in the big data session, but our data wasn't huge. It was the smallest data set I've probably ever used in a real problem. It was in the tens of terabytes, right? So not very huge. I could run it on our big challenge was when we built our models, how to operationalize them, as I said before. So our models, some of them were more complicated. Some of them were very simple. It would depend on what data we had about each. So for persuasion, the data we had was, we had voter registration data, which is public. We knew what elections people vote in, which is public. And then we knew, some things about if they gave us money, if they volunteered for us, if when our volunteers called them, did they say they support Obama or not? And that wasn't a lot of data. And so the models were not complicated eventually, but complicated to build because they needed to predict some phenomena that's pretty hard to predict.
Now, what kind of technology did you use for running those models?
All of them. All of them and none of them. So if you guys remember the previous, a couple sessions ago, right, there was a big chart with lots of technologies. We didn't use pretty much most of them. We ended up building a lot of the things. And that meant we used a lot of open source, and that meant a lot of, but also a hodgepodge. Our biggest challenge initially was hiring people, and our two big challenges were hiring and data integration, right, which most people can probably relate to. And what we didn't have time to is take somebody and train them in a new technology. We had from the beginning to end a year and a half to do this. Most people we hired spent about a year with us. So you didn't have 3 months to train them in a new technology. You didn't have 4 months to install, configure, and implement a new technology. So we went with whatever somebody knew. So we used a lot of open source things. We did a lot of coding ourselves in Python. We did Hadoop. We did lots of R. We did a tool that a lot of statisticians and economists use, Stata. We use lots of databases. Every database that exists, pretty much, we had a version of it somewhere. We had 20 different vendors, so we had to write a lot of code going back and forth between them in our data warehouse. So pretty much anything that was out there, heavily focused on open source, but whatever worked, we were using it.
Cool. So if there's a CMO or the head of marketing at a startup in the audience and they're curious about how they could take advantage of what you've done or replicate it for obviously their direct marketing strategies, would you say that the technologies, the models, and the processes and the skill sets are available, usable, and can they take advantage of them today?
If they've got $1 billion and a few million volunteers, absolutely, they can do that. I think what we did wasn't as much as build a new technology stack and software. We built tools for ourselves mostly, and some of them were consumer facing. But what we built was more a way to do this at scale. And another thing we focus on quite a bit is experimentation. So we experimented with everything. Whenever we tried to figure out, should we personalize an email this way or that way? Should we get people to do something on Facebook this way or that way? When I call people, should I say this message or that message? All the experiments and things that we learned, that's something that's extremely valuable, but that's also that's what we really are proud of, right? We were able to learn things at that scale that we could then deploy pretty easily. Whereas any other organization just doesn't have the capacity and the size to really run these experiments and learn these things in the amount of time we did that. So there's a technology piece, but then everything else we learned, I think that's what's more valuable to a lot of CMOs, especially if you're looking at organizations that are trying to be more advocacy and trying to make a social impact. They're the ones who can learn the most from us because people's passion, what we kind of learned was how to take people who are passionate about a cause and turn them into really good advocates for you. And that's something that, you can't do that for Walmart or any other large retailer or CPG company.
Now, you mentioned being able to recruit folks and train them on technologies, but bring them up to speed on just the data analytics aspect of it. Do you see as in terms of the skills shortage, which is frequently mentioned for data scientists in general. I have a couple of questions about that. One is along the lines of whether data science is uniquely a science in its own right, or is it, has it transitioned from being something like rocket science to computer science? Is that a spectrum on which you would place data science? And you have any comments on that?
Right. I mean, I think, that's the current buzzword. It's big data and data science. It used to be data mining. At some point, it used to be, business intelligence and analytics, and the buzzword will keep changing. And you can argue whether data science is a science. Is computer science a science? Is rocket science a science? Rocket science is certainly not a science, but computer science, you could argue. At the same time, a lot of people say that anything that has the word science is not a science, because otherwise, physics, chemistry, biology, they're the real sciences. But I think what for me is important when you think about data science is, if you are saying you do data science, then you better do something with science. You can't be a data hacker. You have to have a principled approach that builds a system and is able to make some sort of guarantees about its future prediction power, its future generalization ability. Without that, you're just doing data hacking. If you pick a tool and you deploy it and you're running it, there is no scientific backing to it, and you need to do that. The talent gap, I think, is an interesting problem, because there is certainly a talent gap in terms of the people who can do these type of things, but in certain areas. So when we were in the campaign, we had a really hard time recruiting, and we had a harder time recruiting than a typical company, because we were not paying people very much, especially given all the hype around these skills. We were asking them to move to Chicago for a year and a half, and if they're really experienced and had a family and had all these things, they just couldn't do those things. So we had a really hard time doing that. Second, they didn't really know that their skills would be useful. So right now I'm talking to you about what we did. 2 years ago when I started, I couldn't have told you what we were doing for many, many reasons. But because of that, I had a hard time. People thought that their skills weren't applicable to anything beyond online ads, hedge funds, and trading. They thought that's where marketing was where their skills are useful in terms of data, and not in the kind of the political world or even nonprofit and social impact world. So I think that's the big gap to fill, is not just there's a talent gap, but then a lot of these people who have the talent don't realize that their skills are useful beyond marketing and beyond online ads and beyond search results. They can actually make real impact in the world, and one of my goals is sort of help them sort of see that.
How are you working on that goal? What are you doing specifically?
So specifically, we're doing a couple things. So now, since the past month or so, I've joined the University of Chicago, and I'm at the Computation Institute, which is an applied research institute over there, as well as a public policy school. And we're working on sort of setting up a group there to do sort of analytics, big data, whatever the buzzword is, for public policy and social good. So one of the things I'm running as part of that this summer is I've got a grant, sort of money from Eric Schmidt, to run the summer program. So it's called Data Science for Social Good Summer Fellowship. And I'm getting about 40 students from around the country, mostly grad students in computer science, statistics, machine learning, data mining, having them come to Chicago. And we have projects that we've gotten, very heavy data-intensive projects from nonprofits and government organizations, and they're in education and healthcare and energy, transportation, public safety. And my goal is sort of have these students spend 3 months working on these problems to, one, kind of help them learn how to solve real problems, but then also be exposed to these social problems that actually matter. And also help these nonprofits and government organizations understand how to use data to do these things, how to take people who have these skills and really work with them, because it's a two-way street. They need to learn that the data scientists need to learn how to solve these problems, and their role is important. These organizations haven't done this before, so they need to learn how to communicate, how to structure problems, how to use them. So that's my plan for this summer, and trying to get these students excited and motivated to work on these problems.
That sounds really cool. So when you talk about organizations like those that are government agencies or nonprofits or non-government organizations and their use of data, in some measure they depend on the availability, access to open data sets, if you will. Are there one or two things that you would sort of look for from federal, local, state governments in terms of the data that they provide to you and others like you to help them with this?
Right. I mean, I think the challenge is most of these organizations have the capability to collect good data themselves. They just don't know what they need to collect. So today, a lot of them rely on part of it being open data, but what we're trying to get them to move towards is really collecting their own data, because that's the best way of really making an impact. I mean, the challenge with open data is it has to be anonymized and aggregated to a level that it's completely innocuous. And if it's that level of aggregation, it's not really useful for any practical problem. The kinds of problems most of these nonprofits and organizations want to work on are how to impact an individual. So one of the things we're looking at is how do you make students who have risk of dropping out of high school, what do you intervene, how do you predict who they are, and how do you intervene to help them not do that? Or people who might not apply to college, or kids who may be at risk of childhood obesity, how do you intervene with them? All those things require individual level information that's not aggregated. If you do aggregate data, then you're trying to figure out what region basically is at risk, and then you go door to door, and that's not a scalable or sustainable way of doing it. So I think there's always going to be a tension between open data being the detail that you need it to be versus its utility. And the easy way out of it is for these nonprofits to really figure out, and it's happening in healthcare a lot more, but education is getting there, but how to collect this data at a level that they can start doing these things themselves.
What strikes me is that when a data scientist has access to that level of data and that granularity of data, they have great power, and with great power ought to come great responsibility. Would you suggest that then data scientists take a Hippocratic oath of doing no harm before they can practice their art or their science?
I mean, I would hope that everybody who's doing this kind of work in these areas already has taken that in their heads. It's not an explicit thing, but I don't think they're out to find the people who and expose their information, right? I've had access to all sorts of data, very sensitive data about people, and I think there is that implicit agreement. What's going to change though is, your first question was related to the insight part. What's going to change is it's going to be less these data scientists doing, deep insights, more a machine will look through this data and make certain predictions and take certain actions almost automatically, and the human will get involved when there is a problem, right? So the human doesn't need to know a lot of the details. So I think there's going to be both the human-computer interaction in the data science world is going to have to be done in a way that you can keep all this data private, because even though you may not want to expose this, you might accidentally expose this. So it's less willingly exposing some of this data, it's more accidentally. So as long as you make a system that only brings in a human when it's necessary, for 99% of the work, it's just operational, right? So if you're doing, if you're a marketing organization, you're sending emails, no human needs to know what, or if you're doing pricing, no human needs to know if this guy got $24.34 and this guy got 23.3. So I think implicitly, yes, everybody has taken that oath in my mind. I don't know if it makes sense to make it more explicit, but I think most of these things are going to be done by machines anyway, without humans in the loop.
So for the social entrepreneurs in the audience, is there one last parting advice that you would give them before we unfortunately wrap?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of the challenges today that we face, in my mind at least, is in the social entrepreneurship world, is that you're often choosing between doing good and making money. And I think that choice shouldn't exist. You should be able to do something good for the world and not have to financially suffer. And I think that's a challenge that I don't have a solution to that, but that's something that's both people who are in this space have to learn how to figure out how to do. And I think we're moving towards that world where if you're showing value, then you should be rewarded. And right now, a lot of foundations and a lot of people do impact investing and all this. And for them, it's a side thing. It's not their main way of doing things. And I'm curious about sort of people's thoughts on how you make that a more sustainable business model to to sort of do social good and not have to sacrifice for that. So.
Fantastic. And if there are any questions, you should feel free to stop by and talk to Rayid. Well, thank you, Rayid. It was wonderful talking with you.
Thanks.
Thanks.